He shared with me this second presentation. It's a kind of evolution, next step from the presentation that he did for the webinar, the IFAC webinar in MITC, Adaptive Learning Systems. So I think this is also great. I have a look on the illustrations. This is perfect. And I hope you enjoy. We are in a small number, but the quality is the same, right?
Quality is the same. It's good. All right. Thank you, Tiago. I can keep the motivation for this one short. The motivation was, with the previous work I've seen, I would love to do it online, like in real time, online adapt to the data you see. But I don't know how to do it, or not yet. So the point was, let's first solve an easier problem where you have an explicit controller, no predictive control, no online optimization. Let's see if we can solve for this one. Which brings you back to the reinforcement learning problem and adaptive control. And so I read up, of course, the literature on both sides is vast. I read up on both of them. And now a lot of people tried to bridge between reinforcement learning and adaptive control. And this is my attempt to do the n+1th bridging, indicating the last n were not successful. Probably this one neither, but I'll give it a try anyways. Good. So here's no climbers. These three are climbers. That's good. So this was mostly produced by, I have almost a separate team in China that work on these topics. Friends in Italy and Sweden. So perspective on data control, you've already seen that, so I'll keep this short. Short version is this world of data-driven control has been investigated separately in control and in computer science. And already back in sometime like the early 2000s, these guys, Sutton and Bartow, those are the ones that invented reinforcement learning. Like they wrote the first Q-learning paper. They already realized back then in the 2000s, oh, reinforcement learning is direct adaptive optimal control. It's like the first time these two communities tried to bridge over by the inventors actually. And there have been various attempts over the years. The latest, I think, was a survey here by, maybe you know her, Anuradha Anaswamy, MIT, who also wrote a survey about the intersection of reinforcement and control. But to be honest, none of these have been successful. And I think the reason is just because there's cultural gaps. So there's a common root actually to both problems. The common root is dynamic programming. It all goes back to the Bellman equation, solving a dynamic programming problem. And there have been crossovers early on in the name of neurodynamic programming, approximate dynamic programming, or adaptive dynamic programming. But these never really took off. They always remained like niche, never became mainstream. And I think the reason that I've identified is really culture gaps between especially adaptive control and reinforcement learning. That is, adaptive control originally came out of nonlinear control. That is, if you're an adaptive control person, primarily think about the world as a continuous time stabilization problem. Whereas if you come from reinforcement learning, you think about the world as an online optimization problem. Sometimes these two things meet up, like extreme seeking is maybe a popular example where they meet up, but often they never meet up, the stability and the optimality perspective. They're often disjoint. Another culture gap is what should you do with uncertainty. As I said in the previous talk, should you go for min-min or min-max? That is, are you robust, or should you embrace uncertainty for exploration? Another big culture gap is control people like to write theorems and proofs, which is fine. Reinforcement people embrace compute. Say, we don't necessarily care about proving things, we'll just outcompute the problem. So a different culture. And also what you call a solution to the problem. Say if you're this Saturday, Sunday in San Diego at NeurIPS, you'll see plenty of empirical studies like cool robot demos doing all sorts of whatever things with reinforcement learning. But in control, you would not call a cool robot demo a solution. You would care about theory certificates. And so this is just a bunch of the culture gaps, why I think these two just don't find together, or have not found together. At least that's my reading of the literature and talking to people in both communities. And as I said, today I'll try the n+1 attempt. I try to cross-fertilize the two. But I think it's mostly a cultural issue. It's not because the problems are incredibly hard. It's just that they don't fit together, the people. I guess probably yesterday you had here Romeo Ortega, who's like an extreme person on that end, like as anti-optimization as it can be. Whereas, in reinforcement learning, that's the other side. As you can see, these will never talk with each other. Sadly, Rome is not here, but I'm sure he would share my assessment. Data-driven pipelines. So from the previous talks, you remember this picture? That is when you design a control, two pipelines are direct, indirect. So indirect is the model-based pipeline. So you get your data, you identify a model, ideally also an uncertainty estimate, and then you do control design. With a direct model-free approach, you just look for policies compatible with the data. And what I've just shown you was one of them. Data informativity is another one. But there's also two other pipelines which are very important when you want to go to an online setting. And that's whether your algorithms are actually offline or online. So there's this so-called episodic setup, which is a nicer name for offline, but it's episodic, meaning you collect a data batch. From the data batch, you design your policy. You whatever method, like the ones I presented before, Q-learning or whatsoever. You run it on the system. You collect more data. You repeat the process. But this comes in episodes, like 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds. You never really do this in real time. And there's the real online setting as it's embraced by adaptive control, where your algorithm itself is a closed loop. So the algorithm itself runs in closed loop all the time. So you take a measurement, you update your policy, you act on the system, you collect a new measurement, and you repeat every single sample all the time, which are yet two other perspectives on how you design these controllers. So these are 4 pipelines now. And there's well-documented trade-offs. I already talked about these two. But these also have the trade-offs. Like here, there's only so many things you can actually do in real time. This is much easier, but you're always running behind eventually. So it turns out what you care about. You care about optimality versus stability, modular end-to-end, or all of them have limitations with data, compute, and theory, what you can do. The gold standard, if you could achieve it, how to design a control policy from data is the following. Gold standard already says gold means you can never achieve it, right? But ideally, you'd like to have a solution that's adaptive. That is, in real time, you update your policy to the data you see. Ideally, you want to be optimal, but at the same time robust. This should be cheap, meaning these algorithmic implementations should be recursive, simple, cheap to compute in milliseconds. And as I convinced you maybe in the last talk, maybe also the direct approach often is superior to the indirect approach, mostly because you don't have to propagate uncertainty. So among all the pipelines that you could build up and variations of all of these things, this would be the gold standard. Okay. Now, of course, this problem is hard to study. And you can do plenty of cool implementations, run deep neural networks on reinforcement learning, do cool things, but you don't learn anything from it. That's why I would like to present the very basic problem, the most simple one I can imagine, and the only one I actually can solve, which is the linear quadratic regulator, the LQR problem, which is sort of for both fields, both control and reinforcement learning, it's the benchmark problem, right? If you cannot solve this one, good luck solving anything else. So setup is a linear system, x plus is ax plus bu, plus a disturbance, say, for instance, Gaussian noise. You close the linear feedback loop, u is kx. What you care about is an output, performance output set. When you square it, set squared is your familiar x transpose qx and u transpose ru, the famous Kalman linear quadratic control cost. So the problem, which is really the most basic problem of reinforcement learning, and also the cornerstone of control, if you want some, ever since the moon landing, is the following. You'd like to minimize a running cost, which is essentially this here squared. So you want to minimize x transpose qx, u transpose ru, averaged over all times as time goes to infinity. So the stationary control error in expectation over the noise, subject to linear dynamics and subject to a linear feedback policy. That's sort of the simplest problem. If you cannot solve this, you may just well go home. But it turns out this is already not that trivial. And of course, people developed all sorts of variations of how to attack this problem. So there's online adaptive, indirect, offline episodic, and so on approaches, because this has been invented in like 62 or so. As you can imagine, ever since the 60s, people looked into this from all sides and colors. It turns out, so we originally just wanted to look at this problem as a pedagogical example and to teach ourselves how to do it. But it turns out there were quite a few gaps that were not resolved. For instance, there was never an attempt to solve this LQR problem in a data-driven fashion directly from data without a model and adaptive, which again, given 6-7 decades of LQR, given 3-4 decades of adaptive control, it was surprising to me that this was open. There's no adaptive LQR solution. I don't think it's because it's very hard. It's because people in adaptive control didn't care about it, right? Because who cares about optimality anyways, right? At least the people that were back then in the day, the nonlinear control people. Also, when you look into the world of reinforcement learning, where they studied this problem, actually they only make statements about the algorithmic convergence, like some Q-learning, policy iteration, whatever converges, but they don't say anything about the closed loop guarantees. So there's no closed loop certificates on any of the reinforcement learning or adaptive dynamic programming. So also adaptive dynamic programming, which sounds very control-C, has been developed by control people. They published thousands of papers, no single paper that talks about closed loop. It's all about open loop problems. So despite that problem being as old as time, apparently it has not been, the questions I was caring about have not been answered, which I found surprising. So I want to revisit this very, very old questions. How can we solve this problem, data-driven and adaptive in real time? No. So we will revisit these old problems with some new tools. One is this guy, you already know it, Willems, who said, let's forget about models. Instead of models, let's work with data. In particular, let's work with subspaces, a linear system subspace. But there's something even cooler than that, which comes from this guy, Anders Røntzer, in his plenary at the CDC 2-3 years ago. He said, well, let's not use data matrices to characterize the subspace. Let's just use empirical sample covariances. So can we use sample covariances, just really taking a sample, calculating the empirical covariance, and from that develop some sort of system representation and solve it this way. So that's one of the set of tools we use. The other one is policy gradient methods, which is very popular in reinforcement learning. It's very simple. Here's your optimal control gain. I take a measurement, I go down the gradient. So I go down the gradient in the LQR cost. So I take my LQR cost function, I do gradient descent in policy space on the cost function, which again, very classic in reinforcement learning. In control has only been really adopted very recently. So these are the two types of methods we'll mix. So behavioral system theory with covariance parameterization and policy gradient. And with these two, we try to attack this direct adaptive LQR problem. And as you can see, even for a two-dimensional problem, so that's a 2D problem, the landscape of your LQR cost function plotted over your control gains, K1, K2, is by no means nice and convex, right? So you can already see there's a lot of complications coming up if you want to do this. Okay. So what we'll go through, problem setup. How do you write down the problem in a nice way for this adaptive LQR? I'll go through various learning pipelines on how to compute the gradients and how to get policy updates. And at the end, I'll talk about the closed loop, what happens in closed loop, because it's not that obvious what happens. Talk about stability, optimality, robustness. And case studies come from mostly power systems, but some robotics as well. Okay, problem setup. Here's again the LQR problem. Linear system, driven by noise, linear feedback loop. What we care about is the long-time average cost in X and U. This, by the way, if you ever teach that, this is not how you solve this problem in class, right? In class, we rewrite this and solve it with STPs or Riccati equation or whatever. So let's rewrite the problem so that we can actually solve it. One parameterization is the following. We can use what is called the controllability Gramian, or also called the state covariance. That is, I look at my state times state transposed, averaged over all time. Okay, this is essentially the state covariance, sigma, and I can rewrite this entire problem in sigma. For instance, this here I could write as trace of q times sigma. Right? Trace of q times sigma. So I can rewrite the entire problem in terms of these matrices, which gives rise to all the famous Riccati equations, LMIs, and so on. In particular, the x transpose qx is your q times sigma, so that's trace of q sigma. If I plug in for u is kx, I get trace of k transpose rk sigma. If I were to multiply the entire state equation by x transposed and also use that notation, I get here what is called the closed loop Lyapunov equation, or the Lyapunov equation for the controllability Gramian. So Lyapunov matrix equal to identity plus the Lyapunov matrix sandwiched in between twice the closed loop matrices. Okay. Very classical, has been developed probably by Kalman himself already. But it turns out this problem you can actually nicely solve. It's like just one change of variables away, one show complement, then you can write this as a semi-definite program and you can solve it very easily. So this is how these problems are normally solved. You know this much better than me probably. So this is the standard parameterization. So in terms of algorithmics, normally reformulate this in SDP or use a Riccati equation, which is contracting, interior point methods, or just iterative policy evaluation improvement. There's many methods how you can solve this thing. Okay. Let's look at it from the data-driven perspective. And let's look first in the simple setting where you have the indirect approach. So let's say we have data that we collect from our system. In particular, we have a time series from our states from 0 until t-1 of our inputs from u0 to t-1 and your disturbance. Of course, the interesting thing is you don't have this. You don't have your disturbance time series, but it's there. There's a disturbance time series. There's also, the output is just a state shifted by +1. So x1 and x0 is just a +1 time shift in between. And all these matrices are related by this equation, which are your dynamics, right? This is just your state equation written in terms of data matrices. What makes it interesting is that this disturbance matrix is unknown. Otherwise, the problem would be easy. You don't know this one. And what you need to assume if you want to do anything reasonable to solve this problem, you need to assume what is called persistent excitation. That is, your matrix consisting of state and input data has to have full row rank. Turns out that's, for instance, a necessary condition to solve a least square problem or a necessary condition to solve the LQR problem. So those are the assumptions here. And then the way the problem is normally classically solved and formulated is the following. Again, a bi-level optimization problem. The inner level is just least square sus ID. That is, I look at the residual between the left and right hand side. I don't know the W0. I look at the residual x1 minus BU0 minus AX0, and I find the minimizer of A and B. Okay, this gives me my sort of best least square estimate, maximum likelihood solution, A hat and B hat. With the A hat and B hat, I go into the model-based equations. So that's your model-based LQR solution. And this, bless you. And this is what is called certainty equivalence design, because of course this inner solution will be not perfect. It will be uncertainty. In particular, it will be, for instance, if your disturbance is Gaussian, then this might come with some variance, and here I just take the mean. And I don't forward propagate this uncertainty into the model-based equation. That's why it's called certainty equivalent. But that's the baseline. And of course, all of this is written down now as offline. Okay? And offline is lame. Right? You know, on my previous talk, also the data was offline, but it's somewhat lame. Why is it lame? First, I don't think it's very sporty. Ideally, you want to do this all online. But more importantly, you don't want to separate your online control from your offline learning. Right? Ideally, you'd like to do it all online, because if you just take your offline data, you cannot improve online over the solution you've seen, and you cannot adapt rapidly to changes in the system. That's why I guess that's the selling point for adaptive control, is you'd like to do both learning and control online. You don't want to separate the two. Right? Here this is offline, I get the K, and then online I run USKX. But ideally, you want to do this all online. So that brings us to adaptive control. I realized, sorry, Thiago, adaptive control is a very contested arena with many conflicting, schools of thought and people conflicting. Among others, there's no universally accepted definition of what is even adaptive. Right? If you ask anybody in adaptive control, what's your definition of adaptive control? Most people say I don't have one, or they give you different ones. So the definition I took is the one by a guy called George Sames. And his definition very much resonates how people in reinforcement learning think about adaptive control. I should say George Sames was an enemy of adaptive control. Like, he was in the robust control camp, and he was battling adaptive control all his life. And when I once gave this talk to an adaptive control audience, they were not very happy that I even mentioned his name. Is that so? That's sort of the classics. Like, if you had this guy that was here yesterday sitting in here, he would probably be very offended right now. In any case, so he had a definition which I think is a very cool one, because it very much resonates how reinforcement learning people think about the topic. He namely defined it by monotonicity principle. He says a control is adaptive if over time you acquire information, and if over time you improve the control performance. So your control performance can be improved online is better than the best offline a priori performance, which is really how people in RL think about the problem. And he has nothing in his definition about stability in face of uncertain parameters or whatsoever, which of course a large part of the adaptive control community focus on such a definition, but I'll take his one. So I desired adaptive solution. We want to do this online, so non-episodic, non-batch in terms of the algorithm. We'd like to use closed loop data. Ideally, we want to have a nice recursive implementation that we can run as fast as we want. And ideally direct, but let's see what we hope for. The question is, how do we best adapt online? Which to me is very obvious. I guess any news kid on the block would say, yeah, of course, online you run your stochastic gradient descent or whatever, like you just go down the gradient. Which is extremely natural when you come from machine learning or reinforcement learning. But again, in adaptive control, this is not necessarily the mainstream view to think about it. They have methods depending on gradients, but not gradients in policy space. So we'll do that. So here's what I try to do now. I have my linear system, AX plus BU. I close the control policy, U is KX, and I go down the gradient. And all of this I attend simultaneously. So here I do policy gradient descent. This I take my LQR optimization problem. I compute its gradient in my control policy parameters, and I go down the gradient. And I want to do this online all the time. Turns out I need to also keep on injecting a little bit of noise to have persistive excitation, which is, again, the most naive and simplest thing you can do. Again, surprisingly not worked out. It seems very obvious. Devil is, again, in details. And first of all, on the algorithmic side, how would you even compute this gradient? How would you compute it? How would you evaluate it online, right? Cheaply, recursively. Direct, indirect, does this converge? That's on the algorithmic side. On the closed loop side, you could argue, well, even if this guy here converges, that does not imply that the entire closed loop has any sort of convergence, stability, optimality properties, which have to be understood. But so what I'll do today is really figure out, can you do this all at once, and how do you efficiently do this? Quick preview, does it work? Before we get into the math, let's see if it works. So here's an autonomous bicycle. Fun story, this was, well, I'll tell you a story once we see the video. Bicycle dynamics are notoriously non-linear, non-minimum phase, so hard. So we took a low-order model of the bicycle, like some sort of second-order model with the main dynamics or fourth order. We did a feedback linearization, canceling out the main nonlinearities. And then we strapped around this our adaptive LQR solution. So a linear controller, U is KX, and then go down the gradient policy space. So here's what happens. So here's the bicycle is nicely riding. You see the control gains are evolving over time, and eventually they're converging. So I guess it works. First observation. Now, why was this interesting? Autonomous bikes are fun to look at, but the real story was in Sweden, Volvo wanted to do crash tests with the autonomous cars. They wanted to do crash tests on bicycles, whether the autonomous car could avoid a bicycle. But they, of course, didn't want to use humans. And so they were very interested in having an autonomous bicycle that they could crash the autonomous cars into. That's why this was interesting for them. So it's fun to look at, but there's an actual use case behind it. So, long story short, this sort of very naive pipeline apparently works. It will not always work. In this case, it worked. So close the linear feedback loop, adapt your control policy online by going down the gradient. Let's try to understand it. Before, are there any questions on what I want to do now? Or on the motivation? If I cannot solve this problem, then all of reinforcement learning is hopeless, right? So this may be one that could be solved. Okay. So here's the algorithmic roadmap that we sort of developed. There's many ways how you can compute a gradient. There's, I guess, direct, indirect, and then many different metrics on how to compute gradients. Some are better than others. I first want to go down the most naive route, which is the indirect policy gradient. So I take my data, I identify a model, I compute the gradient. Apply it, repeat. So let's try to understand this. So here's again our LQR problem. One thing you should realize, if you took a bachelor system theory course, is that this Lyapunov equation, as you all know, has a unique positive definite solution. It's called the controllability diagram. Essentially, it's A plus bk to the power k, same transpose, summed over all time. So this has a unique solution. So essentially, I can eliminate the sigma from these equations. So sigma is uniquely defined. So this entire problem is only a problem of the k variable. So let's understand it at the k variable. So for some problems, this is actually quite nice convex optimization landscape. So for this two-dimensional AB problem, Qi2R1, this looks like essentially a convex problem, and going down the gradient in k should get you to the minimum, right? It turns out it's not always this way. It can often be non-convex. The example I showed you before was not convex. However, we can at least say if I would now be anywhere in the region where k is stabilizing, then I can compute a gradient. So it's differentiable. Very good. You can compute a gradient. Don't need to go to subgradients or whatever. It turns out there's an explicit formula for the gradient, which is this one. What I want to point you at to evaluate this formula, I have to know the unique sigma here, so the controllability Gramian. I also have to solve for a p. P is something called the observability Gramian, which you can also compute from one Lyapunov equation. So you need to solve two Lyapunov equations, this one and this one. And of course, I need to know QRAB. Then I can compute the gradient. So this would be the gradient. It turns out people already knew the gradient in 1970. So already in the papers in the 70s, people worked out that this is differentiable and you can compute the gradient. However, it took them until 2019 to understand that gradient descent would actually converge. So in 2019, they worked out another result showing that this cost function is cursive, that is, the level sets are compact. So as you go to the boundary, this blows up to infinity. It's essentially in the range of stabilizing controllers. It's a well-defined optimization landscape. It is smooth, that is your second derivative. The Hessian is bounded, or the gradient is Lipschitz continuous. And it has a nice property called gradient dominance, that is J of k, can be upper bounded by the minimum plus gradient squared. It turns out these here are the minimal assumptions to show that gradient descent converges to the global optimum. So once you have these assumptions in place, also called PL convexity, or I forgot what PL stands for, Polyak and Losiewicz something conditions, you can show gradient descent converges. So the statement is the following. You have your problem here, and then 2019 worked out. If you have your initial policy stabilizing, and then initialize from here, you run gradient descent, then you converge globally to the minimum of this optimization landscape. In particular, you converge with a linear rate. So first takeaway is, yes, you can do gradient descent on the LQR problem, and it will converge. Second is, why did it take from 1970 until 2019 until finally somebody showed that? I think it's just because people didn't care. Which is, again, a culture gap that is, this was developed very well in reinforcement learning, not at all in control. And it took somebody from reinforcement learning, where is she? This one, Marion Fossell, to bring it over to control. So she's an optimization theorist. And I think not because it's hard. You can prove these things like 5-6 lines of math. It's mostly people didn't care, because why would you solve LQR with gradient descent? Doesn't make sense, right? We have cut the equation, we have LMIs, it's good enough. So again, culture gaps. It's not hard, just nobody cared about it. So takeaway, LQR problem, if you initialize yourself in the stabilizing control gains, even though this may be non-convex, you get to the global optimum. Okay. So things converge. Which points at the first adaptive control pipeline. It's the following. You collect your data, you get a new data sample. With this new data sample, you solve for A hat and B hat with least squares. You can do this recursively. You get one new sample, you do the recursive least squares, so rank 1 update. So this is extremely cheap. You compute the gradient. The hard part is computing a gradient. For the gradient, you need the A hat, the B, the Q, the R, and 2 Lyapunov equations. So there's a lot of things you need to solve for solving one gradient. But once you have the gradient step, you go back and repeat. Okay, and this would actually converge, at least on an algorithmic level. What happens in closed loop is save that for later, but you can do this, and on an algorithmic level, this will get you the global optimizing policy. But again, it took until 2019 until people understood that this very naive algorithm would actually converge, just because culture gaps. Now, going down the gradient is fine, but if you, again, have an optimization course, you probably learned that going down the gradient is very inefficient. So people develop variations of gradients, like a Newton direction or a Fisher direction called natural gradient and so on. Let me show you why. If you have a cost function which has very long level sets, very elongated ones like this one, gradient descent would always be orthogonal to the level sets and would eventually take a very long way to converge. So people figured out ways to go around this, to make these level sets round. In particular, you would pre-multiply the gradient by the inverse of the Hessian matrix. And this would, at least for a quadratic problem, give you perfectly rounded level sets. It's called the Newton metric, and you go there straight. Problem is, nobody wants to compute an inverse Hessian. It's very expensive. But they figured out ways to approximate this. So they have some approximate, called Gauss-Newton schemes, to essentially pre-multiply the gradient with some positive matrix that makes it cheaper. You can actually show, if you do it with this inverse Newton metric, then you get some algorithm out of it from reinforcement learning that would just alternate between evaluating the policy and improving the policy. Meaning evaluating means take your current policy, solve the Lyapunov equation. Once you have the Lyapunov equation, improve the policy. So you have here new k, which is p transpose inverse p or so, and you just alternate between the two. That's actually what this one does. There's other gradients people have explored. Famous one is natural policy gradient. So if a cost function like this, yeah, you could go for gradient descent. It'll take you a long time, right? Instead, if you had some sort of hunch that you have to go over this barrier here, or you have to go not down the steepest route, maybe the less steep route, you would win. And so people figured out how to find the less steep but more informative route. In particular, you would, again, take your gradient and pre-multiply by a matrix. In this case, this matrix is what is called the inverse Fisher information matrix. Just think about it as variance. So you multiply this thing essentially by inverse variance. Inverse variance means you go in the direction where variance is large. So you go in the direction that is uncertain. And going in the direction that is uncertain may give you a quicker path, especially when your data landscape is complicated. Again, you can show that this might be easy to do. So in this case, this would just be the gradient times an inverse of the sigma matrix, which I had before, and you can solve this efficiently. Okay, but this is all, of course, model-based, so you can compute the gradient. Remember, for computing the gradient, I need the A, the B, the Q, the R, okay, Q and R I have, and I need to solve these Lyapunov equations. Can you do this better? So let's see if we can go on the direct route. Before, are there any questions on?
Just a comment. In Newton version of the external recipient control, we find a way to estimate the Hessian inverse recipient relation. So maybe you
Okay.
can check it.
So you do essentially. Okay, so you approximate the second derivative.
Average is important.
Yeah.
Maybe you can mix this stuff.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, it's a good thing to do. It's just computing it cheaply.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go down the other side. Let's go down the direct route. Can we do this without models? And you probably already know an answer. You could do what I did before in the previous talk, parameterize everything by data matrices, and then try to compute the gradient from the data matrices. We'll do something like this. Let me first show you how reinforcement learning people do this. So why direct? Is that uncertainty propagation is hard in the indirect method. And the outcome suffers, of course, from bias errors, so you'd like to go direct. Here's how people do it in reinforcement learning, or maybe also in extreme seeking is similar. It's essentially probing the system, and from probing the system, you learn the gradient. Okay? In optimization, you call this zeroth order optimization. That is, if you want to compute the derivative, you just apply finite difference approximation. So you evaluate the function left, you evaluate it right, divide it by 2, and you get an estimate of the gradient. That's in one dimension. When you go to high dimensions, it's very costly. In high dimensions, I need to perturb my function in a random direction u. So u is just a uniform distribution with some radius r. I go in plus direction u, I go in minus direction u, multiplied by u with some scaling factor, and that gives me the directional derivative in direction u. So that's essentially, this is the directional derivative in direction u, if you make r small enough. Now, of course, you need to explore all directions, so you take the expected value of this. And it turns out the expected value of this thing is exactly your gradient. So this in expectation for r going to 0 is the gradient. Standard results from zeroth order optimization. You could use also other things like more sinusoidal perturbation as an extreme seeking, but this is what you do. Now, where's the catch? I mean, I cannot evaluate this thing in expectation. I can sample it many times and do sample average, meaning I have to evaluate it very often. But more importantly, the issue is the following. Think about evaluating J of k, evaluating the LQR cost, meaning you have to run the system with this control gain for infinite time and compute the average of x transpose qx and u transpose u. So of course, you don't run to infinity, but you need to run it for long term. So just to evaluate this, you need to run long experiments and many experiments. Not very practical, especially not in high dimensions. In high dimensions, this blows up very quickly. So here's an example. So I have a system of order 4. Okay, so I have total something like 6 unknowns. And I want to get within 1% accuracy of my optimal solution, going down the gradient with probing methods. It turns out if you got to 1% accuracy, I need to have 142 or 143,000 trajectories, each being at least 100 time steps long. So in total, I need 10 to the 7 samples of my system to get within 1% of optimality, if you subscribe to zeroth order optimization, which already tells you it's not a good method. It means also reinforcement learning you can do if you have a perfect simulator that you can query infinitely often. But this is nothing you want to do in real time. That's nothing you can do adaptively or interact with the system 10 to the 7 times to get within 1% of optimality. So takeaway is, while this idea of gradient descent is a nice one, it turns out in practice it's completely useless. At least if you do it this way. Okay? That's sort of the standard zeroth order. So what can we do? So we'll use this behavioral parameterization to the rescue, in particular sample covariance parameterization, which will allow me to compute the gradient with one sample only, right? Or at least update the gradient every one sample I get. So I don't need 10 to the 7 samples, because a system of order 4 has A matrix has 4 entries, your B matrix has 2 entries, so it gives you 6 unknowns. I don't need to have 10 to the 7 samples to get 6 unknowns. Comments, questions, concerns? Maybe that's by reinforcement learning, you wouldn't throw in a physical system, right? Okay. So we'll use a sample covariance parameterization. So I skipped for now the noise. I'll put the noise back into the picture in a minute, but now this is without noise because it's easier to explain. So again, I have my input data series from 0 to t. My output data series just shifted by +1. And here this other input data series. Okay. What I do now, I write down the sample covariances. So I take data matrix of inputs, data matrix of states, times the same one transposed, divided by the length of it, which is your empirical sample covariance. Due to the persistive excitation assumption, this empirical sample covariance is always positive definite. I mean, you can invert this matrix. I can also compute the covariance between my current state and input to my next future state, so essentially covariance between inputs and outputs here, which is x1 times this vector divided by 1 over t. So I call this lambda, and I call this lambda plus. And again, just like before, in the previous talk I told you there's only one thing we need to pay attention. Now comes the one thing in this talk we need to pay attention. Everything else follows. The one thing is the following. It's a bunch of linear algebra tricks. First is a change of variables. So I don't want to work in policy space, I work in space K. I'd like to go to a new variable. Let me call V the new variable. What is in between K and V? It's just a coordinate transformation that is linear. In particular, I just put the sample covariance in between. So the vector Ki is sample covariance times V. This change of coordinates can easily be inverted because my sample covariance is positive definite. Okay, yeah, sure. But why? Why would you care? Why would you do this? So here's a few fun tricks. Only one trick, actually. So let's look at the closed loop. We'd like to parameterize A plus BK. If I know how to parameterize A plus BK from data, I can do everything else. I can compute Lyapunov equations. I can solve LMIs. You know, all the LMIs, everything depends on A plus BK. If I can replace A plus BK by data, I have one. So A plus BK is BK plus A, which KI you may see here. So let me substitute the green box here. So this is then BA sample covariance times my new variable V. Also, you see here B times U0, A times X0. B times U0, A times X0. So let me plug in my model equations right here. Here are the model equations. So BU0, AX0 is X1. And I get X1 here. Next, I see that this thing here is just my sort of future covariance, which is this one. So I can write it like this. Okay, so why would you care? Why is this now interesting? I mean, this is all just cheap linear algebra tricks, just a coordinate transformation. It's the following. What I can do now, I can replace A plus BK by this covariance times my new variable V and the green change of variables. Meaning I can now take any of my favorite LMIs that anybody's written down, like H2, H infinity, QR, anything you can imagine, and replace A plus BK by data and another database constraint. And V is now your new optimization variable. So literally take anything you'd ever read in a robust control book or optimal control book for linear systems, and you do this change of variables, and you get to a data-driven formulation of the problem, which is quite nice. There's no need to identify any AB, right? I can just do this as it is. So for the previous problem, so I do this substitution here. So I get to new variable V. So I take this previous problem I had, that's the LQR problem. I replace A plus BK by sample covariance times V. And I also need to have this change of variables here. And I go here. That's my new problem. And this new problem, there's no more A and B. There's no more system. It all parameterized by data. So now I can write down all my LMIs, not parameterized by the model, but parameterized by data. Means I don't need to identify anymore a system model. I can just solve the LMIs in a data-driven parameterization if you want to. Particularly here, I could immediately eliminate the variable V. I mean, a K. This is positive definite, so I could eliminate the K. Also, the solution to the Lyapunov equation is unique. I could eliminate the sigma. Essentially, all of this is just a problem in V, and I could do gradient descent on V. Or I could solve this in SDP solver, also fine, but I don't do this. Any questions? Because this is like maybe the key part where things go from standard obvious textbook material to non-obvious.
I see that this formulation follows the first style.
Correct, yes.
Do you have any other results using the data from
So we can do the same in the DePersis formulation. In the DePersis formulation, if the problem is that your data matrices grow over time, they're non-square. Whereas these covariance matrices are always square. They're like sizes n plus n square. They don't depend on the data. So they're much more, well, better to evaluate, right? What you could do, you could also take the data informativity LMIs and try to compute the gradient of those. Though I wouldn't know how to do this, to be honest. Yeah. But yeah, it's essentially the thesis and DePersis approach that we took.
And this approach often gets to equality constraints.
Correct.
Those equality constraints are also present in
This one. That's the equality constraint.
introduce some conservativeness into the solution.
Yes, so another thing about, sure. So if you go down the PES approach, then the way they do this change of coordinates, this here will be non-square, and there will be a big null space here, meaning they will not have a unique solution and need to add all these regularizations or whatever min-max formulation to make the solution unique and choose a good one. In this case, since this matrix is square and positive definite, there's a one-to-one mapping, so you don't get these type of particular problems. So I find it essentially a better choice of coordinates. Yeah, here would be the comparison with the PES approach, which we also worked out on their side. But yeah, matrices are independent of data size, uniqueness, and you can do recursive updates, which you couldn't do in the formulation. So here I have a same problem as before, not just in the new coordinate v. I can eliminate k. If I wanted to, I could eliminate sigma. But notice there's always a linear constraint equation. Okay? Meaning if you now do gradient descent in v, you can do this, but you need to, when you do the gradient descent in v, you have a projection here. The projection is of that linear constraint. So you don't do gradient descent, you do projected gradient descent. That's the price you pay. But now I can do projected gradient descent. What I need to do to calculate the gradient, I need to solve for sigma here. So one Lyapunov equation, but that's it. No model, nothing involved. And it turns out if I go to the same problem, which before I need 10 to the 7 samples, I can now do it with 6 samples, get to global optimality. Means if I have 6 samples of my system, 6 samples are enough to parameterize this problem and to compute a gradient. And in the clean case, when there's no noise, with 6 samples, I can do gradient descent and I go down to 0 optimality gap. So I went from 10 to the 7 samples to 6, which is exactly the number of unknowns in the system, which now makes this thing actually useful, right? So that's why 0th order is not very useful, but now, yeah, essentially now I have a data-driven parameterization. I can compute directly the gradient, and I just need 6 data samples for the 6 unknowns, essentially, and compute a gradient. So now I have something I could actually use on the real system without knowing a model. Good. Questions? So when you do this, so here's your projected gradient descent. You could now go back, once you know this equation, you can go back into the real coordinates, essentially just by inverting this coordinate change. So you have k is lambda times v. And in real coordinates, this projected gradient descent would again be here some pre-scaling of your gradient. But the pre-scaling now depends on the data. Some sort of covariance, here's your projection. So it depends on the data. But essentially, it's again some particular metric in which you go on the gradient. So this is just on the one hand for interpretation. We don't do it this way, we do it this way. But also, if you want to prove anything, it turns out you can just recycle the previous proofs and apply it here. Because all that is in between the original gradient descent and this one is just a positive definite matrix. Fact 2, if you compute the natural gradient descent in these coordinates, so I multiply all of this by the inverse variance, then it turns out I get coordinate invariance. That is, I get back over here, but without the MS identity. So, or M is the model-based inverse covariance. Why is this interesting? It just means you can take all the previous proofs and recycle them, apply them one-to-one here. So these are just for interpretation of the proofs. So all things you can do, but from the previous talk, you probably understood that this only all works in case you don't have noise, right? This one here is a little more robust. It also works in noisy setting. But it turns out if you want to counteract noise, you need to, again, throw in some sort of regularization. So you don't compute the gradient on the original cost, but on some sort of regularized cost. Why is that? You know, all the gradient formulas I derived for you, I neglected here the plus W0. So I neglected the noise effect, meaning all the gradients I have will be wrong, because to really compute the real gradient, I would have to have here the W0, which when I repeat all these matrix calculations, it will be here a lambda plus minus W, if I had it here. But I don't have it. So how do you robustify yourself? So now when you have here W0, the A plus BK would not be anymore covariance times V, but covariance minus something that depends on your noise. Particularly, it's the correlation of your input state data and the noise sequence. So again, it's some covariance here. But you don't know this thing. So you cannot do this. I could think about repeating previous calculations, but I don't know any of that. That's the problem. So we thought about a trick, again, inspired by PES and thesis, which is the following. Well, this is the problem I should really solve. I should really solve the LMIs with this one. So I get a Lyapunov equation, which is parameterized in this, but I don't have it. But what I can do, I can try to minimize the difference in solutions. When I compare the Lyapunov equations, I would have to solve with this one, minus the Lyapunov equation that does not have this, which I can solve. I see the difference of the two would be something of this thing here, would be your optimization variable V, state covariance, V transposed, and again, here's your empirical correlation, which is all things I know. Meaning if I want to robustify myself, I should make this term here small. That's the sort of the easy track. So we don't minimize the LQR cost, but we minimize the LQR cost plus something that makes this here small to make sure if we solve this problem, we also solve the problem that would include the noise, which we don't know. And again, the price to pay is you need to tune this lambda here. It's your regularization constant. So the hope is when you solve this problem, then you also solve the other problem. Let me jump maybe straight to the results when you look into the plots. So if you do not regularize and you just solve the data-driven LQR problem using gradient descent, STPs, or whatever, then only 90% of your solutions will be stabilizing. So this is, I think, averaged over 1,000 simulations. So only 90% of them you get stabilizing solutions. For the other percent, the corrupted data destroys your stability. But once you start regularizing with this particular regularizer, you go up to 100% of the solutions being stabilizing. That's good. So that's what we wanted. That was the point of that. Another thing that we did not want, but we take it came for free, is surprisingly also your performance improves. That is, once you start regularizing, your suboptimality goes down. So what you see here is the median optimality gap. So it goes down not by much. Before we were at something like, 25%. No, 0.25. 0.25% and go down to 0.18. So not much, but it improves also performance. It's an extra quadratic term on your cost that also improves the numerics. Let's skip that. Let's skip that as well. Okay. So what I told you about now were all methods to compute the gradient. I can do it model-based. I can do it data-driven. I can pre-multiply the gradient by some positive matrices like a Newton direction or natural gradient, or I could robustify myself. So we know how to compute the gradient. We know the gradient descent would converge. So what I can do now is I can run my policy gradient descent in closed loop, where this M could be any of the previous ones you've seen. Newton metric, inverse Hessian, or data-driven parameterization, whatever. And you know that if you were just to run this block here, only this one in isolation, this would converge. Only this block in isolation. But that's not the problem we want to solve. We'd like to understand what happens in closed loop. So we'd say, surely, if you initialize this from a stabilizing policy, you go down the cost, you remain stabilizing, then surely, if every single iteration here is stabilizing, and it decreases, and this thing converges to the optimal solution, then also the entire closed loop should be stable and converge. No, it doesn't. Why is that? It's a switched system. At any point in time, this thing here will be a stable policy, stabilizing. But essentially means you switch between different stable systems. And you can easily destabilize any problem, right? Because it's just multiplying a bunch of stable matrices. Even though every one is stable, it does not have any implication on the overall sequence of matrices being stable. So just looking at the algorithm isolation, that's what reinforcement learning people do, does not tell you yet anything about the closed loop behavior. So that's what we want to work out now. And there's a cool tool that embarrassingly got not developed by control people, but by computer science people. It's called sequential stability. Essentially, it says, if your closed loop matrices do not change too much, so you can put a bound on how much this changes, then you also get closed loop stability, or then you get stability with a time-varying gain. Sequential stability, which I found really cool, and I found it very embarrassing that we did not develop that. But I guess computer science, again, they were interested in this much earlier. So to state the main result, I need two things from Sames. One is the information metric. So he said a control is adaptive if information grows. So for this, I need to tell you what is my SNR. So in particular, for my noise term, I take the correlation between my noise signal and input state. I call this here delta. And for my signal term, I just take my sample covariance matrix and its lowest singular value. I call this gamma. And the ratio of the two, gamma by delta, is my signal to noise ratio. That's my information metric. So any well-designed control should increase the information metric over time. So that's sort of the same first monotonic principle. Say if your noise, for instance, would be Gaussian and your excitation is constant, then your signal to noise ratio would grow as square root t. So you keep on growing information. Even when you use a decaying excitation in the system, it turns out your SNR would still increase. So even with decaying excitation. Why is this important? Because it turns out the results that tell you about stability in closed loop depend on the signal to noise ratio. So here's the main result. I'll break it up to small pieces. What are the assumptions? We need an initial stabilizing policy. So if you don't have a time zero stabilizing control, none of this works. That's, I guess, a reasonable assumption. Further, you need your signal to noise ratio to be sufficiently large, and you need a step size sufficiently small. Why do you need a step size sufficiently small? It's because if the step size is small of your policy gradient descent, that also means your variation in control gain will be small, which also means you have closed loop stability. So I guess it goes back to adaptive controls must be slower than the plant. So small step size. Under this, you can make a statement that the state converges, your performance gap, so optimality converges, so you get to the optimal solution. That's this, so you have nominal exponential conversions. But you get a bias term, and the bias depends on your signal to noise ratio for the performance, and it depends on your excitation, both the active one you throw in and the exogenous noise here. So that's due to excitation and noise. So you can show everything also works in closed loop, with the main difference is you need to choose a small step size. Okay. Which is annoying, but I guess that's the price to pay. You cannot adapt infinitely fast, which probably was expected from the beginning, but it tells you when you want to apply reinforcement learning in closed loop, you better apply it slowly. And reinforcement learning algorithms that don't have any notion of step size, you probably should not run in closed loop. Let me forward to the simulations. Here. So I have a system which people consider a benchmark in reinforcement learning. It's not that exciting. You can actuate all channels, so B is identity. Your A matrix is some sort of Laplacian discrete time matrix, so it is almost stable, but it's in a specular radius slightly above 1, so unstable. We throw Gaussian noise at it, and we compare different solutions. The one shot is just benchmark. That means at any point in time, I would solve the least square problem, the perfect one, and I would solve the LQR problem, the perfect one, at any time. That's my benchmark. You see, if you apply this benchmark in closed loop, it would not work super well. It would maybe converge, but it would go through big oscillations and big spikes. Because this one, again, does not have a step size. It just goes for the best solution given everything you've seen to now, which, as you can imagine, is not very good. Where any of the gradient methods would work well, they're very robust noise, they would all converge. Don't pay too much difference, look at how different they are because it did not tune any step sizes. So if I tune the step size, they can look all the same more or less. So we get what we wanted. When you compare difference between poor data and quality data, if you have quality data, everything is perfect, they all work as much as you hope for. That's all good. If your data is shitty, then clearly the one-shot solution, like solve the perfect problem at any point in time, goes through big oscillations, sometimes unstable, so that's just the 3 sigma, but it would eventually converge. All the gradient descent methods also converge. It turns out Gauss-Newton would actually also not be very robust. Gauss-Newton would also go through these big transients, meaning it has a poor transient performance. I guess because the Newton direction is also the most aggressive of all directions. Going through implementations. So we applied it on a few different problems so far. Some adaptive control for wings, the bicycle you've seen, and some power electronics. I have the power electronics today for you because you've seen it already in the other case study. So again, we have the setting with the wind turbine connected to a grid. And there's a black box, meaning we don't know the grid, we don't know the mechanical part, we don't know the electronics, and we don't know the control implementation. But we see oscillations on the wind turbine. We'd like to take measurements and dampen these oscillations. So we do a LQR gradient descent. Now you should notice in the real world there's no LQR problem. For a very simple reason, there's no state in the real world. Right? In the real world, you only have measurements from outputs. But what you can do, you can just take your output time series and shift it. So you take yt, yt minus 1, yt minus 2, and that gives you a state space realization. So we take this as a state space realization, and then just run this policy gradient descent. In this case, the direct version, and very similar to the deep sea. But notice there's no online optimization problem to be solved. We just use the LQR, policy gradient descent. You see an oscillation, you probe the system, you collect data, and you dampen it very nicely. So it would work. Also more in the spirit of adaptive control. You are the steady state, everything is fine. Something changes in the system, in this case the DC voltage set point, which you don't notice on the control design side. Everything is fine, fine, fine. Then comes a disturbance on the grid side, you go through some big oscillations. If you don't do any adaptation, these oscillations will sustain and eventually go unstable. Whereas with the adaptive version, they would work out. In conclusions, I showed you this block diagram, which is the simplest instance of reinforcement learning I could imagine, and the simplest sort of, I guess, online data-driven control problem I could imagine. I showed you many algorithmic pipelines, a few case studies. Future works, of course, this is a toy problem, right? There's no state space problem in the world or linear state space problem, so we'd like to go definitely, to different system classes, so beyond the LTI. We did not do any active exploration here. So what people in control do, they throw in probing noise. In reinforcement learning, nobody does probing noise. They would say, this is very archaic what you control people do. Let's say we have to explore and explore strategically, active sampling. So how can you do better than just probing the system? And figure out these exploitation trade-offs. And personally, one thing I'm interested in that goes maybe back to more event-triggered control is, now I adapt at any point in time. But is there benefit to adapting maybe only every 10 points in time? Or maybe only 20 points? So what's the best batch size? What's the best stable window? Probably should be something that's triggered, either triggered by a state excursion or triggered by an information metric. I don't know it yet. But I'd like to go beyond the simplistic picture here. Whew, it's been a long day.
Thank you, Florian. Questions? I think they just went to rest now.
That's good. Me too, me too. Thank you all for attending.